There is a catalogue entry in the fragments collection of the Berliner Papyrus Datenbank that most classicists reference without pausing over. It is a partial transcription from the Ptolemaics, the 120 scroll index compiled by Callimachus of Cyrene sometime around 245 BC, listing every work held in the Library of Alexandria, organized by discipline, then by genre, then alphabetically by author. The fragment records titles we can no longer read by authors whose other works no longer exist in fields of inquiry that were not rediscovered for 1,000 years. I spent 3 weeks trying to cross-reference the surviving entries against known texts. The ratio is difficult to accept. Of the dramatic works alone, we have roughly 6%. But what stopped me was not the mathematics of loss. It was the pattern behind it. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single fire. It was destroyed 4 separate times, across 7 centuries, by 4 different civilizations, each of which believed it was the most advanced culture on Earth. That is not a tragedy. That is a system. I found the pattern because I was looking for something else entirely. I had gone to the fragments expecting to find a single lost title. What I found instead was a system of loss, one so consistent across centuries that it began to feel less like a sequence of accidents and more like a structural feature of how civilizations treat accumulated knowledge when it becomes inconvenient or simply irrelevant to those in power. To understand how the library functioned at its peak, and therefore what was lost when it contracted, I have been working from the institutional records of the Ptolemaic dynasty, particularly the reign of Ptolemy II Philadelphus and his successors in the 3rd century BC. The library was not a single building. It was an intellectual infrastructure embedded in the Museion, the research institution housed in the Bruchion, the royal quarter of Alexandria adjacent to the Great Harbour. The Ptolemies did not merely collect books. They engineered a system of acquisition that has no real parallel in the ancient world. Every ship that docked in the harbour of Alexandria was searched. Any scrolls found on board were confiscated and taken to the scribal workshops attached to the Museion. There, scribes produced copies of each text. The copies were returned to the ship, the originals were kept. Galen, writing centuries later, describes this policy with a kind of bemused admiration, noting that the owners of the scrolls received their copies and nothing else. The library grew not by donation or purchase alone, but by systematic appropriation. Ptolemy III Euergetes went further. He borrowed the official state copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides from Athens, depositing 15 talents of silver as a guarantee of their return. The silver was considerable. He kept the originals and sent back copies, forfeiting the deposit without apparent concern. 15 talents of silver was, evidently, a price worth paying for the authenticated manuscripts of the 3 great tragedians. The cataloguing system was equally unprecedented. Callimachus of Cyrene, working under Ptolemy II, compiled the Ptolemaics, a bibliography that ran to 120 scrolls and recorded the author, title, opening words, and line count of every work in the collection. It was the first systematic catalogue in recorded history, and it established a method of alphabetical ordering that Zenodotus, the library's first head librarian, had pioneered. The estimated holdings at the library's height range from 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls, depending on whether one counts the subsidiary collection at the Serapeum, the temple complex in the city's southwest. The scholars who worked there were not minor figures. Euclid composed the elements in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth to within 2% of the modern value, using the angle of shadows at noon in 2 different cities. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 17 centuries before Copernicus. Hero of Alexandria built a working steam engine, the Aeolipile, that was regarded as a curiosity rather than a technology. These were not isolated geniuses. They were products of an institution that concentrated intellectual labor, preserved its outputs, and funded research across generations. Everything I have described so far is the library the world remembers. What follows is the library the world would rather not examine too closely. Here is where the history becomes a pattern rather than an event. The popular account holds that Julius Caesar burned the Library of Alexandria. That account is not wrong, but it is dangerously incomplete, because it allows us to treat the destruction as a single catastrophe, an act of war, regrettable but contained. The truth is that the library was degraded 4 separate times across 7 centuries by 4 distinct civilizations, each at or near the height of its power. What does it mean that 4 separate cultures, each convinced of its own superiority, each committed what amounts to the same act of indifference toward the largest accumulation of knowledge in the ancient world? The repetition is not incidental. The repetition is the evidence. The record does not support the story we were taught. It supports something worse. The first destruction is the one everyone knows, or believes they know. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar, besieged in the harbour district of Alexandria during his pursuit of Pompey, ordered his ships set alight to prevent them falling into Egyptian hands. The fire spread to the harbour warehouses. Plutarch and Dio Cassius both record the burning of scrolls, though they differ on the scale and on what exactly was stored in those warehouses. Some scholars believe it was a transit depot for scrolls awaiting cataloguing, not the main collection. Others argue the losses were substantial. What is not disputed is that the library survived. Strabo visited Alexandria roughly 2 decades later and researched at the Museion, describing its covered walkways and communal dining hall without any mention of catastrophic damage. The institution continued, but it continued diminished in ways that no single source fully quantifies. I keep returning to the harbour when I think about this period. The scribal infrastructure that I described earlier, the teams of copyists working the docks, checking arriving ships, cataloguing new acquisitions, that system was still functioning after Caesar's fire, though the evidence suggests it had already begun to contract. I am imagining a scribe at those docks in the decades after 48 BC, a composite figure drawn from the kind of labour Galen describes. He is working with papyrus that has arrived from a ship out of Athens. He is copying a philosophical text, perhaps a commentary on one of the pre-Socratic thinkers, the sort of secondary work that no one will think to preserve when resources tighten further. The Pharos lighthouse is visible across the harbour. The ink is fresh. The institution, as far as this scribe knows, will outlast him. The second destruction is the least remembered and possibly the most devastating. In 270 to 271 AD, the Roman Emperor Aurelian besieged Alexandria to reclaim it from the breakaway Palmyrene Empire under Zenobia. The fighting was concentrated in the Bruchion, the royal quarter where the Museion and its library had stood for 5 centuries. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century, describes the Bruchion as largely ruined. The destruction was not targeted at the library specifically. It was targeted at the district that happened to contain it. The distinction matters because it illustrates the mechanism. Knowledge was not the target. Knowledge was simply in the way. By the time of the third destruction, the institution had migrated. The surviving collection, or what remained of it, had been consolidated at the Serapeum, the temple of Serapis in Alexandria's southwest. In 391 AD, the Christian patriarch Theophilus, acting under the authority of Emperor Theodosius I and his edict against pagan temples, the decree recorded in the Codex Theodosianus as XVI.1010 ordered the Serapeum demolished. 5 separate chroniclers describe the event. Rufinus, Socrates Scholasticus, Sozomen, Eunapius, Orosius. I have read all 5 accounts carefully, cross-referencing their descriptions of what was found and what was destroyed. Not one of them mentions a library. Not one of them mentions books. If 5 separate witnesses described the destruction of a building that had once housed the world's greatest collection of texts, and none of them mentioned books, does that silence tell us the books were already gone, or does it tell us that their loss was no longer considered worth recording? I have not been able to determine which interpretation is worse. The 4th destruction is the most contested. The tradition holds that in 642 AD, when the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria, the Caliph Omar ordered any books that contradicted the Quran to be burned, and any books that agreed with it to be redundant, and therefore also burned. It is a rhetorically perfect story. It is also almost certainly apocryphal. Bernard Lewis, in a 1990 analysis that I consider the most careful treatment of this tradition, demonstrated that the earliest source for the story dates to the 13th century, nearly 600 years after the alleged event, and that no contemporaneous Arab source records it. The story persists not because it is well evidenced, but because it is useful, because it assigns the final destruction to a single, foreign, religiously motivated act, which allows every other civilization involved to avoid examination. I want to pause here because the cumulative weight of this sequence matters more than any individual event. 4 destructions, 7 centuries, Roman military expediency, Roman imperial reconquest, Christian iconoclasm, and a story about Islamic book burning that the evidence does not support, but that the popular narrative has never been willing to release. Each civilization believed it was doing something more important than preserving knowledge. Caesar was winning a war, Aurelian was reunifying an empire, Theophilus was purifying a faith. And the tradition about Omar provides a convenient ending that absolves everyone who came before. The scribe's successors, generations later, were working in a diminished scriptorium. I am imagining this based on what the documentary record tells us about the decline of institutional patronage after the 2nd century BC. Fewer colleagues. Older papyrus, reused because new supplies had become unreliable. The copying program had contracted from a harbour-wide operation to a handful of specialists working in rooms that had once been full. The reading rooms of the Bruchion, after Aurelian, were empty. No source records when the last scholar left. No source records when the last lamp was extinguished in a room that had been lit continuously for 3 centuries. Go back to the harbour. Go back to the docks at Alexandria before any of the fires. A scribe is working late on what I am imagining as the last night the operation functioned at full capacity. He does not know it is the last full day. He is copying a medical text from a ship that arrived that afternoon. A treatise on surgical technique or pharmacology, the kind of practical knowledge that would need to be rediscovered from scratch a millennium later. The harbour air carries salt and the faint mineral smell of ink. The Pharos light turns above the water, throwing its slow rotation across the eastern breakwater. He finishes the copy. He checks it against the original. He shelves the original in the transit depot, in the place assigned to medical texts, awaiting full cataloguing, and he walks home along the harbour wall. The ink is still drying on a papyrus scroll that will not survive the century, shelved by hands that believed the institution would outlast them. Of the plays of Aeschylus, we have 7 out of perhaps 90. Of Sophocles, 7 out of perhaps 120. The complete geographical works of Eratosthenes, which map the known world with an accuracy that would not be matched for 1500 years, survive only as citations in other men's books. The Ptolemaic itself, the catalogue of everything, is gone. We know it existed because other authors reference it. We cannot read it because no copy survived the system that was supposed to protect it. The question I keep returning to is not why the library was destroyed. It is why we keep telling ourselves it only happened once. 4 civilizations, 4 destructions. Each one believed it was doing something more important. How many of the institutions we rely on today are protected by anything stronger than the assumption that they will simply continue to exist? Defunded libraries, discarded archives, entire digital repositories rendered inaccessible by obsolete formats within a single generation. The pattern did not end in Alexandria, it did not end in the 7th century. The library was not destroyed despite being irreplaceable. It was destroyed because no civilization has ever reliably chosen knowledge over power. The conditions that destroyed the library are not historical. They are operational. They are present tense.